video, I built a jam chuck for a bowl that I've had for a long time. Matter of fact, I had forgot it was even here. I couldn't even see it until I cleaned up. Once I cleaned up my shop, I came across this blank that I had rough turned a long time ago. It was this oak platter, and at the time it was turned to about the max capacity of my lathe, which is probably about 15.5 diameter. It wasn't quite the max, but anyway, I turned it, just kind of roughed it out a little bit. I left a divot down here so I could get the center later. But this thing was turned in 2014, in March of 2014. And I mean, it's way dry. I don't have to worry about it being dry or anything like that. So once I turn this, I can I can be pretty rest assured that it's not going to move anymore. It's not going to crack anymore, anything like that. As a matter of fact, when I turned this, when I rough turned this, I took it and I set it under my workbench over there. It wasn't in shavings or anything like that, but you can see there are no cracks. Let me see how the camera is looking. There are no cracks in this bowl or this platter anywhere, not one. Nowhere. Okay? And that was just sitting out here in the shop under the workbench. But anyway, we're going to get started. I'm wanting to turn this into a platter, like a serving tray platter type thing. But just to give you an idea of what happens when these things dry, it started out, it's 15 inches now, so it's probably about 15 1/8, 15 1/4 lengthwise across this way. But right here, it's now 14 7/8. I mean 7/16. And you can see it warped this way also. So we got a lot of truing up to do on this thing. But it was allowed to sit over there and dry just by itself, however it wanted to dry. It warped up, and the way it wanted to warp, at the speed it wanted to warp, and it didn't crack. Okay, you see this a lot. You don't necessarily have to put things like in a pile of shavings or in a paper bag, things like that. I've had just as good a luck doing things just like that right there. The walnut bowl that I did, it was a natural edge bowl. I did a couple of years back anyway. Had the natural edge around it. It was a spindle turn. Didn't have any cracks in it. That thing sit for years right here under the lathe. I've got other pieces down here also that have sit under the lathe, and no cracks. But anyway, we're going to put this on that jam chuck that I made, and we're going to see what we can do with it. Try to get this tenon trued up. And make sure when you green turn these that you turn your tenon big enough so once you remount it and true that tenon up, that it'll still fit your chuck. I made that mistake before too. After I got my tenon trued back up, my chuck wouldn't close up small enough. So make sure you very liberal on the size of your tenon when you make it to begin with. All right, well, let's get this party started. We got a platter to make today. Right there. Let me back this up just a little hair. Okay. All right, let's get this thing and see what we got. Keep her slowed down till. Okay, you see I've got a wobble here. If I speed up just a touch, that wobble will go away. Okay? So what it is, it's like a harmonic. Alright, so anyway, I'm about 300 RPMs right now. It's a pretty big bowl, and you know, it's off balance. So anyway, alright, let's just see if we can't get this back in balance a little bit. Okay, well, once the bottom's fairly true, I've got cut all the way across. I'm just going to kind of work on the tenon. Now the tenon, you know, I want it square. Mine is a square jaw chuck, and so I need a square tenon. If you've got dovetails or anything like that, some type of profile, you need to make sure that you get the correct profile on your tenon. But here I'm just removing a little bit of the thickness of the tenon down to about 3/8, so the tenon doesn't actually reach the bottom of my chuck. And then I'm going to make sure everything gets squared off really well and trued up so that it fits in my jaws really strong. We'll just grab the skew, and I like using a skew because I can get both angles really well and get this tenon really smooth and really square. I can get with a skew. Now I'll work on the shoulder. The shoulder is where a lot of your strength comes from, and it really needs to be square also. Even if you have a dovetail or a profile jaws, this needs to be very, very square so that you can hold it together. Okay, now I've got it turned around, mounted in the chuck, and we're just starting to true up the front or the interior of the bowl, or the platter, or whatever you want to call it. It's pretty big. It's kind of like a serving tray. Ended up being about 14 inches. But we'll just get everything trued up. And this thing had warped a lot, so it's taken a lot to true it up. You can see a little bit of movement on my tool. Okay, now we got kind of the rim is trued up. We're just starting to kind of true up in the bottom, knocking off all the rough stuff and just getting it where it turns really well before we start hollowing this out. And it's almost true now. I'm still just roughing it down to get it true. And I believe this was my first good pass, so the interior is true now. So I'll move around to the back and get my profile the way I want it and get it scraped down before I work on the front anymore, or the interior. Here I've got the shape that I want, and I'm just getting it scraped down. And this is a 3/4 inch round nose scraper that I'm using here. Really good tool. Really good tool. It needs a very light touch. Okay, now I'm starting to work on the interior,
and just checking the thickness around the rim. I'm just matching the profile to the back, to the exterior of the bowl, and I'm right dead at 1/4 of an inch. So I'm good. I'll work on the exterior or the outer diameter first, because it's going to get weaker as I go. So I want to get it. I want to get the profile done and all that before I actually start taking too much meat out of this bowl, just simply because it will get weaker and it may start vibrating the more wood that I take off. So I'll do I'll move in about 2 inches at a time, maybe an inch or so, and I'll scrape it and everything and finish that up, all but sanding. And then I'll move to the next area until I get closer to the center where it's a lot stronger. And then that last bit there, I'll do it all at one time. But right now, I'm just taking little bites, making sure I'm scraped down and my profile's good. Once I've got it all hogged out and scraped down, now I'm just gonna sand. And I usually start my sanding around 80 to 100 grit. This is 80, and it'll help me make sure there's no tool marks, no ridges, nothing that can catch the eye and detract from the bowl. And people have asked me, how I like my new lathe. It's actually not very new. I've had it for 2 years now. And all I can say is I love it. It's great. It's a beast. It's got a lot of power. And it's quiet. That's my favorite part about it, is it's quiet. It turns very quietly. Okay, now that I'm sanded all the way up through 120 grit, I'm just gonna start burning this the grain just a little bit. If you put a flame on this oak, you can see how the grain just pops out, and I love that effect. I use it on mugs and everything else and just love it. But you cannot let that flame stop, because if it stops, it's going to leave a deeper burn. And I don't have my flame turned up very high either. So you just have to keep that flame moving, and don't let it stop. And just work on it however you want to burn it. And I like, kind of burning the rim a little bit more than the rest. It looks pretty good. I don't want ashes. I just want it to look good. So here I'm working on the very edge, and you can see how I flip the torch to the outside every time I have to stop my hand. That gets the flame off the wood. If that wood stops and that flame's still on it, it'll just look awful. But I ended up doing the entire front of the bowl, and this happened. It warped when I heated it, which is fine, because I was kind of going for like a rough look, or not a rough look, but like a rustic type look on this bowl. So I kind of like the warp, actually. And I still have my center point and my tenon and all on the back, and as I remove that, I can true up the bottom, and the bowl will still sit flat. So no harm done, and I actually like the way it came out. I didn't get to do what I wanted to with the bottom, but it still turned out to be a really nice piece. So now you see it's splotchy, sort of splotchy, and no matter how you burn, you still get that. But once you sand this, I've already sanded the 120, and I'll work through 220 and 320, and all that blotchiness will just be blended in, and it'll look really good. So I'll just get all my sanding done, and then I'm going to put on a coat of sanding sealer. And this is a lacquer-based sanding sealer, so it cures up really fast. It'll be actually set in just a few minutes, and it'll be cured. It'll be cured within a half hour. I'll be able to sand this, finish up all my sanding on it. My brush was a little small. I just didn't realize that this is a 14-inch plate or a bowl, and it was a little bit too big to be using that little brush. But I had already started applying this stuff, and if I had stopped to grab another brush, it would have just hardened up. So I just tried to keep a wet edge and let her eat. But don't dally if you use a lacquer-based sanding sealer. Now here was the bowl after I got sanding sealer on it, and this is before my final sanding. My final sanding after I put on the sanding sealer was 320. That's as far as I went with this bowl, and it ended up with a really nice shine once after I waxed it. So here I'm just sanding it at 320, and this is right after the sanding sealer is cured. I didn't go back to 220 or anything else. I'm just sanding back to the grit that I sanded before I applied it. We'll just make sure we rub it all directions and get the whole thing sanded really nice. And I had applied 2 coats of Minwax, paste finishing wax, and it looked really good. My camera battery had died during that time. I didn't really realize it, so I didn't get that footage, but I just put on 2 coats of Minwax paste finishing wax, and it really gave it a nice sheen. Now it's time to work on the bottom, and when this thing warped, the bottom got out of true again, so I had to re-true the bottom. I didn't really get to do the decorating that I wanted to do on the bottom. I actually wanted to put a very small foot, like a bead all the way around, but I just didn't have the wood to do it by the time I finished. So I'll check to make sure my gouge is centered, and then we'll get busy truing this thing back up. It's very hard to true up a bowl that has been warped. Like right here in the corners, rounding it over, you can't take too much. It doesn't matter, unless you're going to true the entire thing back up, you just have to find a place that you can stop. But the good thing is the bottom's good and flat now, and I can round those edges over with sandpaper, and it'll look great. So now we're going to start taking off the tenon, and I'm just using my 3/8 bowl gouge. I'll just start working it down. I'll work it down until the nub in the center is about 3/4 inches or so, and then I'll do the rest with a skew. And I've already sanded everything to the tenon, So the only sanding really left to do will be just where the tenon was once I get finished. And I'll finish the bottom the exact same as the rest of the bowl with sanding sealer and wax. Here I am removing the last bit of the nub, and I'll use my skew with a toe and heel parallel with the bowl, and I'll follow the back of my skew all the way down, making a conical shape and scraping the bottom as I go. And once I get it down to about 1/8 of an inch, we'll take this thing off the lathe. A little bit of sanding and we'll be done with this thing. And there again, I'll sand through about 120 grit, and I'll put my sanding sealer on and go on 220 and 320. And then wax it. Okay, now we're all sanded up. It's time to get this thing off the lathe. Now the nub will just snap off. Okay, little touch up with some sandpaper, and that thing will be good.
Well, I hope y'all enjoyed that. I sure did. Like I said, this was a project I started in 2014, and it's just been sitting over there under my workbench the whole time. No cracks in the bowl. There's still no cracks in the bowl, even though it warped a little bit more when I burned it. But man, those burn marks really bring out the grain in this. Really makes it look nice. Let's see if you can see that. I think you can. But see it, and then once you sand back over it, it makes it really subtle. So it's a nice effect, but it's a very light burn if you do that. And you cannot let that torch stop. If that torch stops, even for a split second, it'll burn a mark in there. So you got to keep that thing moving when you do something like this. But that oak, man, it really just brings that grain out like crazy. But I really enjoyed this project, and I want to talk a little bit about jam chucks, because I had a question the other day about the way I turned my recess. I use this as a recess, and I expand the jaws into it. But I left this right here, and some people thought I was using that as a tenon. No, I wasn't. I just didn't turn that out. It serves absolutely no purpose. I could have just as easily turned it out and accomplished the same thing. I just didn't do that. But that's that. This thing is concave in the very middle, right in here, so that I get good contact around the edges. And once you remount these, and they're pretty thin, you got to be careful that you don't break your bowl by pushing too hard on the tailstock, by putting too much pressure. And if a bowl or a platter or whatever is really thin, you can break them with a vacuum chuck also. You know, that's just the way it is. It kind of becomes a feel. You know when you can get a good friction drive. Make sure you don't operate outside of your jam chuck, the diameter of your jam chuck. At least not too far, because the further you get out, the weaker that bond is, that hold, and you can start getting a wobble, and it'll start getting this thing back out of balance again. But I hope you enjoyed the video. We did a depth sanding sealer finish on this, which I keep this here. I actually buy that stuff by the gallon at my hardware store. There's other brands. It's just this is what my hardware store carries, is Deft. It's lacquer-based sanding sealer, and it dries or cures up really fast in just a few minutes. You know, it's like lacquer, you know, and it cures up really quick. And I do have some oil-based sanding sealer too, but it takes so long for that stuff to cure. You know, I want to put this stuff on and get it sanded so I can wax it and be done. And I use the Minwax paste finishing wax. I've been using it for years and years. I love it. It's good stuff, and you know, it puts a nice little shine, you know, on it. So it's really nice. But we finished up the bottom. The bottom sits nice and flat, even though the bowl's warped. It sits nice and flat, no wobbling. So we're good to go there. Hope you enjoyed it, and we'll see y'all down the road.